Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Helen. It's time for our Saturday book. And this week we're addressing a subject that I have aggressively ignored forever. For some weird reason, because I'm always into paranormal stuff, I just wanted to avoid this topic. But a lot of you have asked me about it, and I couldn't respond because I knew absolutely nothing. So I've been covering a lot of kind of heavy-duty topics. We've done some heavy-duty politics, political history, constitutional, presidential history. That was hard work. And we've done, most recently, philosophical stuff, the Gnostics. That requires a few extra brain cells to be firing. And I thought it would be fun to just throw in something a little lighthearted. And I'm not entirely certain that this is a 100% lighthearted topic. It freaked me out. In fact, there are parts of the descriptions in this book I'm not going to read out loud, or describe out loud, because, well, we'll talk about it when we get to the part that I skip. So what am I talking about? The Hunt for the Skinwalker. This is by Kelleher, PhD, and George Knapp. It was written in 2005. So once again, it's not the most recent book, and this topic is continuing to be pursued, but I do have another sequel to it. So if you're very good, then we'll do that sequel as well. Interesting topic. As I said, I knew absolutely nothing about it, except there was a place called Skinwalker Ranch. I've never watched the TV shows. I've never read any books about it. This is my first. So let's get into it and find out what it was about it that freaked me out so badly. Hunt for the Skinwalker, published 2005 by Kelleher, PhD, and George Knapp. So this is the account of unexplained events that were studied for an 8-year period. They happened a lot sooner, a lot earlier, previous to this. On a ranch in northeast Utah, they did a very technological scientific study. These events seemed to defy the laws of science, but they do align with more modern sort of, I don't know if it would be called theoretical physics, and intersect with metaphysics. So that's interesting too. They took a lot of high tech to detect some of this activity that didn't exist previously. I wonder now how much more that's evolved. It would be interesting to find out. There are places in the book where they really dig into, well, we measured with this blah, 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 blah meter, the blah, 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 blah millihertz or whatever. I gloss over that. I find those sorts of really detailed numbers kind of onerous. I'd rather hear the scary parts. But if you really want the exact way they collected their data, it is in the book. So a family lived in this place, and they thought that their ranch, this is the conclusion this family came to, that the ranch was occupied by some sort of intelligence that was able to control human perception, thought, and physical reality. So we're talking a very remote rural area. It's only about 150 miles from Salt Lake City, but it is very sparsely inhabited. It touches on the reservation there. So what you've got is scattered inhabitation of mostly, not exclusively, mostly Native Americans and Mormons. And all of these people are hoping to just avoid the urban thing. So there is a particular mindset, and they talk about that. So there is well documented phenomena. There are well-documented phenomena with the Utes, the Native Americans, and the Mormons who've lived there for more than 50 years. And these events are all part of a much more ancient oral narrative tradition of both the Utes and the Navajo. There are innumerable eyewitnesses. There's physical evidence. There are pictures, videos, measurements, as I said, all kinds of technological data. A board of scientists oversaw this study. They decided to really address what they were doing in a rigorous way as any other scientific observational study would be done. They determined to follow established scientific principles. They were challenged, they felt, by an intelligence that engaged with him, but also that didn't play by the conventional rules of science. They had to modify their techniques because what they went in with didn't always adapt to the situation. They had to adapt. They were giving serious attention to these topics, but this was risky for the people involved because it put them in a precarious position for their professional standing. George Knapp maintained that he was a serious journalist, and he lists this enormous body of work, which you can read in the book. But it's true that he had quite a history, professional history. But because he's willing to entertain the topic of things like UFOs, his peers all think he's a nut. I don't know if he's still alive. I don't want to misspeak. Let me look it up. It didn't occur to me to even look it up. But it's true that he had or has a bit of a reputation for being maybe an iconoclast, a maverick. He's alive and healthy. He's 73 years old. It's not discounting him yet. Be something if we could get him to come and talk. Little inspiration from the cosmos there. So, he was facing journalists who laughed at him behind his back. I mean, let's be real. And then the scientists. So it was official in 1989 so official that they made a multi-part TV series about UFOs and Area 51. And as soon as this came out, they were just pilloried by other people in the business for being fringe. So he describes all the harassment that he went through. Nasty things people said about him. For example, he was referred to as a high priest in the Church of Cosmic Proctology. There is a very entrenched, very psychological, emotional resistance to all of this that I think in and of itself should be looked at. Anyway, he describes mocking cartoons about him. You'll have to get the book to get the details. He said he expected ridicule, but he was surprised at the level of vehemence, at just how nasty people got. He noted that his critics had no familiarity, none, with the topic. They'd already made up their minds. Little green men, tinfoil hats, the usual. But working with the topic let him meet people that were educated and not off the rails, who were successful people, respected in their fields. One of them was Bob Bigelow. Now, he was, if I remember correctly, some kind of aerospace guy, very, very wealthy. George Knapp met scientists and investigators who were serious, and they weren't going into this with preconceived notions. They were going into this, well, okay, we've heard all these stories, and we're skeptics. Let's look at it from a scientific point of view. Let's see what kind of data we can get to support or deny the reality of these stories. And Bigelow who was into aeronautics and space and all that kind of activity, was more than happy to spend his millions to bankroll them, the study. So George Knapp saw that the peers of the scientists were completely unforgiving to the scientists, and he felt badly for them because he was experiencing the same thing. So part one is called the hot spot. Chapter one is called the wolf. It starts out with this very odd story. Now, there are a lot of personal narratives in here, and I've done my very best to bring the stories down to the most salient parts of the story. I leave out all sorts of descriptions that don't have a bearing on the actual events, but they're presented in a very entertaining way. And if you're interested, this is a fun book to read. Scary fun. Okay, chapter one is called The Wolf. So we're talking about a family called the Gormans. Tom Gorman, his wife Ellen, and his father Ed was peripherally involved. They wanted to buy this property. They did. We'll get to that more in detail. But this is one of the big moments, one of the very first big moments. I hope that vacuum cleaner is not going to bother you. Every time I record, something goes on in this house. Anyway, Gorman and his wife saw an animal, and they were completely flummoxed. It was sort of at the far end of a pasture. They had this big pasture near their house with trees on a tree line, and this animal came out of the trees, and they were looking at it going, is that a wolf? It was far enough away where they weren't entirely sure. The distance was affecting their sense of perspective on the size and details. So as it got a little closer, they realized that's like 3 times the size of a coyote, but it's bigger than a wolf. What is that? It had a very weird kind of a looping run. It didn't behave like animals they were familiar with, and they were a long time familiar with animals. I think we should just stipulate they knew about the country. They knew about like he would get on a horse and go for days to collect cattle, just outdoors. So this thing approached them really cautiously. They could tell by its body language. It was wet and it smelled like a wet dog. So they're seeing it, they're hearing it moving, and now they're smelling it. So they feel like this is real. We're not a man. And all of them are seeing this. They had just brought calves. What they did, they raised cattle, and they had these 2 kinds of cattle. I don't remember what kinds that were prize winning. He was really into the genetics of cattle raising. My great uncle did that. He had a dairy farm in Ireland, which I spent some time at, and he had a whole room dedicated to all the prizes he'd won since all the way back to like the 1930s. For breeding dairy cattle. He would get the necessary equipment from all over the world, and just had this small dairy farm, but he was an expert cattle breeder before that was hugely different as it is today with DNA and everything. Anyway, that's besides the point, but Tom Gorman kind of reminded me a little bit of that. Very into, we've got these bulls and they're prize winning, and they have generation after generation of calves that are so sterling quality. So they had just moved in, and they had just brought a pen full of calves. It's hard for me. I don't like how they separate them from their mothers, but that's another book. So they were getting nervous. These calves were like freaking out and trying to get to the far end of their pen away from this animal. It had, they said, light blue, very penetrating eyes. So Tom's father, Ed, was 6 feet tall, and this wolf came up to his chest when he was on all fours. So the head of the wolf was at the chest level of somebody 6 feet tall. They thought weighed about 200 pounds or more, and it was too zen, whatever that means. It wasn't acting normally. It let Ed pet it. I'm not sure I'd reach out. But they stood there and it just was mellow, and they had their children with them, and the kids pet it, they pet it. But all of a sudden, it took one gigantic leap out the calves, grabbed one by the head, and tried to pull it through the corral box. It wouldn't let go, and it was, this was bad. So Tom started fighting with this thing. Now, they all maintain this is what happened. He even had a bat in the car, and he took the bat to it, and it didn't stop. So he ran in the house, got a weapon, and there are descriptions of the kinds of weapons that they used. I'll spare that because of YouTube. It got shot 4 times. It finally let go. It didn't react to the shooting, and there was no blood. Barely reacted at all to the big weapon. It just sort of stopped what it was doing, looked at them, and just casually walked away. So the 2 men supplied themselves and followed after it. They tracked it. They could see clear paw tracks all the way back into the underbrush, and there was no blood. And they followed the tracks, the foot tracks, through the brush, through the trees for over a mile to a creek. And the ground became damp, and they could see deep paw tracks in the muddy area. And they followed it, and then they just disappeared. And they disappeared too far away, excuse me, from the creek, which had a bank you had to go down to get to it, but it was way too far away for what you would consider like a normal animal to jump into the water. And it had 100% vanished. They had no idea where it went. So that was their introduction to their new home. They had just recently moved to this 480-acre homestead in Utah. It had been empty for 7 years. So you have to wonder about that. It was intentionally abandoned by the previous owners. They were living in Salt Lake City. They were more than happy to unload the place. They were wealthy. They were now living, as I said, in Salt Lake City. This ranch was 1 mile from the nearest road. The track in on that road was concealed. You wouldn't notice it. You would never know that there was a home and people back there. The Gormans were looking for privacy, and it makes mention numerous times that they were living in a small town and they wanted to get away from the gossip. But I'm not all the way finished with the book. It still really hasn't addressed what that was. What were they trying to get away from? Reminds me a bit of Chris Bledsoe's story, The UFO of God. So Tom realized that this animal event was inexplicable. It was weird. It was physically impossible, and it was scary. So they did the absolutely normal thing. They just decided to forget about it and move on. I would have moved, but it wouldn't have been moving on. So now we're on chapter 2, the legacy. So, by the way, they bought this house in 1994. So it was a huge, beautiful homestead, 480 private acres, cottonwoods, Russian olives, pastures, a creek, and an irrigation canal. It was bordered on the north by a 200-foot high red rock and mud ridge. It had a canal that had a mud track all along it, and like a path. Both areas were a quagmire nightmare to drive, and if there was any kind of rain, you would get stuck. So you really couldn't drive along the canal, along the creek. On moving in, they faced a lot of work. It had been abandoned and neglected. They had to haul garbage. They had to clear the pasture of rocks and trees. They said the house was odd. Now, I got to tell you, if I saw this, all the doors inside the house had several large deadbolt locks on both the inside and the outside of the doors, like the bathroom door, the bedroom doors, the kitchen door into another room. Now, to the outside, that too. So on both sides of the door, several different deadbolt locks. All the windows were bolted shut. On either side of the house, there was a large area with a metal bar and a metal chain attached. It was really quite obvious that it was for a very large guard dog on both sides of the house. The windows were also barred as well as bolted. And they asked, what were the previous owners afraid of? I don't think I'd stay to find out. This is already setting me up for like, oh, hell no. No. So the original owners, the previous owners had bought the house in 1950. And then they sold it to the Gormans in 94. And they had a purchase contract with the Gormans that they had to abide by that had weird clauses. For example, the Gormans agreed legally to not dig on the land without prior warning to the previous owners. Prior warning is what it says in the contract to the previous owners. The Gormans shrugged it off to, they're old, they're eccentric, they're paranoid. I put in the margin, WTF, red flag. So they were looking for refuge, the Gormans, from gossipy small town New Mexico, whatever that means. Tom was an expert cattle and artificial inseminator guy with a high rate of success. The basin that the ranch is in, so it's a geological basin, is famous, has always been famous for UFO activity. It's called the UFO capital of the world. So yeah, that's a good place to buy a house. It's the most active place anywhere, thousands and thousands of sightings, and it goes back into Native American mythology as well, lore. In 1974, a book was written, The Utah UFO Display, by a guy called Salisbury. That was the first, conventional mainstream discussion of it. Local unofficial UFO historian Junior Hicks, who's lived there his whole life, said the first sighting in my record was 1951. Now, he means the first sighting that he could get anyone to talk about and go on the record. That's, when he started asking was 1951. It was cigar shade sitting on the ground during daylight, seen by 30 students and their teacher from 50 feet away. Hicks, who has been a science teacher, took it upon himself to follow up on the case, separately interviewed all of the kids who had seen the object. He quickly concluded the kids had not made it up. The case so intrigued him that he began to actively pursue other reports of UFOs in the basin. People knew he was the go-to guy if you had a story. He lived there. He was a teacher there for about 36 years. He became trusted by people who had weird experiences because he did not gossip. He cataloged over 400 cases. And he said, that's not counting lights in the sky. I gave up on that. It's really he really only investigated the close encounter stuff, not any of the other stuff. So there really were many more incidents. So this story goes back centuries. In 1776, for example, a priest in the area may have documented a UFO. A huge range of people saw them, and a huge range of types of UFOs were seen. What's his face? The teacher Hicks. He says that people trusted him because he listened. Local cops made fun of people. Media coverage is sensationalist, superficial, inadequate. He listened to people, didn't gossip about it, and didn't make fun of them. He himself saw a UFO in the mid-70s. In 6 of the cases that he's looked into, witnesses saw occupants of the UFO. Hicks thinks that there's increased activity in the basin because of long-time, strong religious beliefs of the inhabitants. I think what he's implying is there's a concentration in that basin now of Native Americans very tied to their oral traditions, which we'll get to, and Mormons who are kind of into the whole UFO thing. So he speculates, is that why? The Utes and the Mormons also may be because, well, those are the people he's talking about, but it also may be because of unique geology and biodiversity. People have seen, the ones who did see occupants, they were taking samples from the ground or the animals or whatever. Now, Hicks makes a really interesting suggestion, which I just wrote all kinds of exclamation points around. He suggests it may be an ongoing psychological exercise to see how we react, a UFO ET study, as it were. And I wrote, this is what Jacques Vallée and Dr. Pasulka speculate, that we are being studied for our reaction to what we see, and maybe what we see is trying to teach us something, and over time. So visits from elsewhere, he thinks, might be for research and exploration, but that's kind of a material world explanation, and it could be in parallel to a more esoteric purpose, which is trying to get a message across to us over a long period of time about our reality. But there have been very frightening intrusions associated with this. Cattle mutilations in the 60s and 70s, Bigfoot sightings, and skinwalkers. Now, skinwalkers are the things that I didn't know about at all. I didn't know what they were talking about, and I didn't feel a curiosity about it, which is unusual for me. I'm usually all in on this stuff. They're evil entities that shapeshift. According to Hicks, the epicenter of all this activity is, guess where? That's right, the Gorman Ranch. Hicks has seen, he said, the inexplicable there. One of the small things he said that's really unusual, if you bring a compass into that area, they just spin out of control. According to legend in the area, this basin is, this ranch specifically, for 15 generations, is in the path of the skinwalkers. So now we're on chapter 3, the basin. Once considered for settlement by Brigham Young in 1860, they found it too challenging of an environment to settle. But it's been inhabited by more than 12,000 years by indigenous people, so apparently it's possible. The first white people to really put down roots there in the 1770s were Spanish priests, Father Escalante and Father Dominguez. And there were the usual trailing in and out white hunters, trappers, traders. In 1862, Abraham Lincoln established the, I hope I pronounce this right, Uintah Reservation, which included the natives of most of the basin. There have been numerous armed conflicts between the Ute natives and the Mormons who did stay and settle in what's called the Provo Valley. The Utes had to leave the Provo Valley, which is pretty green by comparison, and they had to move into this basin, which is harsher, 150 miles east. So I guess Provo is over closer to Salt Lake City, and they got pushed out by the Mormons. The Mormons came and didn't like the basin, so they went to the Provo Valley and pushed the natives into the basin. That's what we're talking about. They were promised the land for all time, but gradually over time, because time has no meaning, the whites started whittling away bit by bit the edges of this protected area. White miners went onto tribal land illegitimately, but they found valuable ores and minerals for industry, so they wanted it. They began mining illegally on the reservation, but when they were challenged, the miners said they petitioned Congress, and they had more than 7,000 mineral-rich acres that belonged to the natives declared public domain. And they threw a $20 bill per acre at the Utes, and many of them were tricked into signing away their land by they got them drunk. In 1881, a parallel reserve was created by Utes who were forced out of Colorado. And because so many, quote unquote, by their definition, hostiles were moving into the area, the military set up an outpost to guard against the Indian frontier. Now I'm giving you the old history. This is their words. We'll just leave that discussion. We've had it before. We'll have it again, but let's move on. So this group of military, they were headed by one survivor of Little Bighorn, and it became Fort Duquesne, I think is how it's pronounced. He rode in with 75 Buffalo soldiers and were greeted by 150 white soldiers who were already there getting ready to greet him. In the Indian Wars of late 1800s, about 20% of the cavalry of the army, 20% was Black, African Americans. And they were called Buffalo soldiers by the Indians because of their looks, their hair and their looks, but also because they were put on trains to shoot indiscriminately at the buffalo to clear the way for not pilgrims, what's the word I want, settlers. Most of these Buffalo soldiers, I thought this was really interesting, were Freemasons. And Freemasons are always seem to always be at the heart of conspiracies. So, piece of salt here, okay? They're a secret society with roots in Egypt. The first group in Europe was in the 1300s as the Knights Templar fell out of favor. By the 1700s, they were kind of like a fraternity, a lot of secret rituals and handshakes and outfits and aprons and symbols and stuff. But despite the charity work that they did, they were regarded with suspicion because of their secrecy. Early lodges, that's what they called their clubhouses. Early lodges were really into, now keep in mind, we're going back to a history from Egypt. Astrologers, alchemists, students of the occult. But because of their secrecy, there was a lot of speculation about them. People said things like, oh, they're servants of Lucifer. Prove it. Many founders of the country here, white founders, were Masons, including Benjamin Franklin. Washington joined for a couple of meetings. He had himself painted in a Mason's outfit, and then he quit. He wasn't into it. It sounded like a bit of a curmudgeon, actually. The Masonic symbols were on the money because of Franklin Roosevelt. It was a 33rd degree Mason, which is supposed to be some very significant level. George H.W. Bush, who went to Yale, was taken into the Skull and Bones Club, which is like the feeder club for the Masons. They only take 15 very rich students a year, and they do all end up in the Masons. Conspiracists say the Masons are into mystical arts and the supernatural. They have abilities. They regard their highest members kind of as gods in spiritual perfection. It's been alleged they're co-conspirators with Illuminati, bilateralists, the Bilderbergers, the one world government, and I wrote in the margin here, Epstein. It's incongruous that the Buffalo soldiers at Duquesne were also Masons, because Masons apparently are kind of a feeder group for the really elite. But it was because of the emancipation of a slave called Prince Hall. This is how they got into the Masons. He came from England and came to the United States, well, the colonies. And on July 3rd, 1776, he established the African Lodge number 1 in Boston. Prince Hall lodges are now all over. They multiplied. There was one in Texas in the mid-1800s where the Buffalo Soldiers joined. That's how they became Masons. And they ended up in Utah at this fort. The Utes know this history, like present day. There's an area of the reservation that was once a Buffalo Soldier graveyard. And it was built over with Ute houses. And the legend is that this awakened an unknown force that created unearthly beasts and weird phenomena that today are taken very seriously by the tribe. And we'll talk a little bit about it. Some of it makes me uncomfortable, and you'll see why. But anyway, Congress declared that it was a public domain. It was neglected because it was neglected, because it was a public domain, this allowed law enforcement into the area because it was an area of lawlessness. And they called it the Duquesne Strip. There were a lot of brothels and saloons. Butch Cassidy hid out there. For the military, the soldiers were told it was off limits, but, they went there anyway. On the ride back home, this is interesting. On the ride back home from this Duquesne Strip, they would toss their liquor bottles into this ravine. And it became known as Bottle Hollow, and it's still full of all these bottles. Mostly there's water in it, but the bottles are still there from the reservoir. So 420 acres of it got filled over and became a fishing spot. And this directly abuts Skinwalker Ranch, which is what the Gorman's Ranch became called. Utes say the lake has large aquatic sea serpents, snakes, and there are many eyewitness reports actually documented by the tribal police. There's a statistically unusually high number of drownings. For example, a Ute woman went swimming with a bunch of other people. She started screaming. She got pulled under. She said, "There's something pulling me under," and it pulled her under. Her companion tried to wrestle what he said was a giant snake, but it took so long that she drowned while he was struggling. Many witnesses saw this on shore. They see strange lights in and out, and including a cop. One cop talked about, well, not only one, but a particular cop talked about this huge light that flew out of the water up into the sky. Let me read you this. In 2002, the authors of the book interviewed 4 young Caucasian men who said they had recently been on the beach with their dates when a blue-white ball of light flew out of the darkness from the direction of the Gorman Ranch. The glowing ball dove into the water just a few feet from the shore, then emerged seconds later. The mystery object had changed its shape while submerged, the witnesses said. From the original ball shape that entered the water, it emerged as something resembling a shimmering, maneuverable, belt-shaped shaft of light. After performing a brief writhing aerial dance, the belt of light zipped away at a high rate of speed, hugging the ground, before disappearing below the top of Skinwalker Ridge. After questioning the 4 men at length about their backgrounds and the sighting itself, the authors concluded that they were honestly describing the event to the best of their abilities. They certainly were not seeking publicity, requested that their names not be made public. That seems to be the running theme. Most people don't want to be involved. They don't want their name associated with it. They don't want people to know who they are. Skinwalker Ridge is this rock ridge with inscriptions near the top, and it would have required, even today, it would require somebody to hang from above to make an inscription. It's at least 100 years old or more. And what the inscription is, it's a Masonic symbol. Uintah County is the heart of the basin. It's 4,400 square miles with a population of 25,000. Most of them are white Mormons. About 1/10 are Utes. They have settlements around near the White Rocks, near Fort Duquesne, and to an almost entirely Ute town called Ranzlet. The area is known for ranching, farming, cattle, hay, alfalfa, and it's also a rich source of hydrocarbons, oil wells, and dinosaur fossils. Now, this is the end of this chapter, and I actually have to go. But I promise I'll make the next video today longer to make up for it. So this is the end of number 1, and video number 2 will start with chapter 4. And just to tempt you to come back, it's called, if this isn't odd enough, what you've already heard, this next chapter is called The Weirdness. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you're enjoying this. Let me know. And Slán go fóill. Slánte.